The Israelites have wandered in the desert for 40 years. They fought multiple tribes and nations and even slayed a giant king named Og. They have firmly established themselves land on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan River. Moses knows he will never enter the promised land with this nation that he's been leading for 40 years. At God's direction, Joshua, son of Nun, has been given his position. Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, leader of the tribe of Judah, is all that remains of the over 2 million people that left Egypt. The second generation of Israelites have never known the comforts that their parents did. They've never known slavery either. They are hard, raised on whatever the Lord has provided. They're nomadic, scavengers, battle-hardened, ready to take whatever God in the form of the pillar of fire and cloud has been leading them to. They've moved to at least 40 locations in the last 40 years, and they're ready to take over the land promised to their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses, now the old sage of 120 years, having learned to read and write in the royal education of Pharaoh over 80 years before, writes down the book of Deuteronomy, as he also wrote the other 4 books of the Torah, and reads it to the generation of Israelites before they cross over the river Jordan. He does this to remind the people of where they came from, where they're going, and why they are going there. Furthermore, he reminds them of how they must live when they are finally established in the land of Canaan. Their purpose is to be a kingdom of priests on a busy thoroughfare where they will not only worship God, but they will be able to show travelers how to worship God. And then those travelers will spread this knowledge to the ends of the earth. All people from every nation and tongue will have an opportunity to worship the one true God. It is important for God's people to be obedient to Him. If they are not, they will not properly represent Him, negating their purpose, losing their God-given protection. Welcome to week 11 of our chronological Bible study, March 11th through the 17th. That's day 70 to 76. Today we're going to cover Deuteronomy. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is what's known as the law. And Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah that Moses wrote and that Joshua then carried with him and finished up the last little bit of Deuteronomy talking about Moses' death, and then carried that over and gave it to the charge of the Levitical priests, who then guard that book and reference it throughout all of Jewish history, and that we now as Christians also reference that book to understand where Jesus came from, where God's people came from, and then we can also understand the character of God better. So Deuteronomy means second law in Greek. Given this name when it was translated into that language centuries later, this is Moses' second telling of the law. The first telling was in Exodus 19 through the end of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And now this is the second telling in Deuteronomy. Since we're essentially rehashing what we read already in the last month or so, we're not going to cover every detail in the book. That doesn't mean that there isn't any good info in the book, though, because Moses adds some very interesting details to Deuteronomy that he didn't give us in the previous books. Israel had their 2 census back in Numbers 26 and Numbers 1. And they now have an army of 601,730 men 20 years of age or older. They have to know how many people they have, not only for military strategy, but also because they must divide up the land in Canaan according to the size of each tribe, clan, and family. Numbers 33, 52 through 56 says, "When you cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan, you must drive out all the people living there. You must destroy all the carved and molted images and demolish all their pagan shrines. Take possession of the land and settle in it, because I have given it to you to occupy. You must distribute the land among the clans by sacred lot and in proportion to their size. A larger portion of land will be allotted to each of the larger clans, and a smaller portion will be allotted to each of the smaller clans. The decision of the sacred lot is final. In this way, the portion's land will be divided among your ancestral tribes. But if you fail to drive out the people who live in the land, those who remain will be like splinters in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will harass you in the land where you live. And I will do to you what I had planned to do to them." To review, we know where these 12 tribes come from. Jacob had 12 sons. Jacob had Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali. Later on, after all the descendants of Jacob have went into Egypt, Jacob, near the end of his life, took Joseph's 2 eldest sons as his own. And then later, Levi gets taken as the tribe of priests. There's no tribe of Joseph anymore. There's 2 tribes of his sons, because Jacob took Joseph's 2 sons as his own and made them their own individual tribes. So when we get to the land of Canaan, they're going to divide up the land according to the 12 tribes: Reuben, Simeon, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. In Numbers 34, the Lord said to Moses, "Give these instructions to the Israelites. When you come into the land of Canaan, which I am giving you as your special possession, these will be the boundaries." So this is the Satellite Bible Atlas. And in that, it shows the original borders of the Promised Land around 1400 BC before they actually invade. These are the promised borders. So the south end of the Dead Sea over to the brook of Egypt and borders the Great Sea. And then the western border is what we call the Mediterranean Sea. Verses 7 through 9 says, "Your northern boundary will begin at the Mediterranean Sea and run east to Mount Hor, then to Lebo Hamath, and on through Zedad and Zephron to Hazar Enan. This will be your northern boundary." So here over to Hazar Enan. So there's the northern boundary. The eastern boundary will start at Hazar Enan and run south to Shephem, then down to Riblah on the east side of the Ain. From there, the boundary will run down along the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee. So you go down, and then along the border of the Sea of Galilee, right, this blue area, it'll follow the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea. From there, the boundary will run down along the eastern edge of the Sea of Galilee, and then along the Jordan River to the Dead Sea. That's verse 12. These are the boundaries of your land. Then Moses told the Israelites, "This territory is the homeland. You are divided among yourselves by sacred lot. The Lord has commanded that the land will be divided among the 9.5 remaining tribes. The families of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh have already received their grants of land on the east side of the Jordan River, across from Jericho toward the sunrise." So over here, you have the land of Gad, the half tribe of Manasseh, and the tribe of Reuben over here. Because remember, they decided they wanted to stay on the east side of the river. There was good grazing land for their livestock over there. Now remember, the tribe of Levi is not going to get a land grant. They've been set apart as the priestly tribe. So there in Numbers 35, Moses says, "While Israel was camped beside the Jordan on the plains of Moab across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, 'Command the people of Israel to give the Levites from their property certain towns to live in, along with the surrounding pasture lands. These towns will be for the Levites to live in, and the surrounding lands will provide pasture for their cattle, flocks, and other livestock. There are going to be 6 of the towns you give the Levites." This is verse 6. 6 of the towns you give the Levites will be cities of refuge, where a person who has accidentally killed someone can flee for safety. In addition, give them 42 other towns. Verse 7, in all, the Levites will have 48 towns within the 12 regions, the 12 tribal lands that are given. Then in Numbers 35, 9 through 34, God gives them specific directions as to how to deal with these people that are running to these cities of refuge. The most important part of this to remember is that in verse 30 it says, "All murders must be put to death, but only if evidence is presented by more than one witness. No one may be put to death on the testimony of only one witness." Now this is an ongoing thing throughout the law, that a person can't be convicted of only one person's say. You have to have multiple witnesses to verify that. Deuteronomy 1 Verse 2, normally it only takes 11 days for them to leave Sinai and get to where they're at. But 40 years after the Israelites left Egypt, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses addressed the people of Israel, telling them everything the Lord had commanded him to say. So then he goes through and starts telling them their entire history from the last 40 years. About the midpoint of Deuteronomy 1, you notice Moses goes back and he says, and God gave respected men and wise men that were selected from each tribe to serve as judges and officials over them. That title of judge is going to be used again. We'll see that in a couple of books. We're going to have the book of Joshua, where they're taking the land of Canaan. After that, we have the book of Judges. These are the people that are wise and respected men. But you'll see some of the judges during that era. That'll be the third generation of Israelites. You'll see that some of those judges aren't so wise. And when we get to Deuteronomy 2, Moses gives us some more detail about these giants that we've been hearing little things about. We know that they slayed a giant king named Og, but we don't know too much about him from the book of Numbers. Here in Deuteronomy, he goes in much more detail about these races of giants that they've encountered before they've even crossed over the river Jordan. So in chapter 2, verse 10, it says, a race of giants called the Ammonites had once lived in the area of Ar. It's one of the lands that they've taken. They were as strong and numerous and tall as the Anakites. So this is a different race, not the Anakites that we talked about several videos ago. These are the Ammonites. This says another race of giants. But the Ammonites and Anakites are also known as the Rephaites. And we're going to encounter these groups and these names again when we get to the conquest. For reference, keep these names in your mind and maybe mark this in your book so you'll understand how this giant thing breaks down. In verse 14, it says 38 years passed from the time they left Kadesh Barnea until they finally crossed the Zered Brook. So this is after the wanderings in the desert. By then, all the men old enough to fight in battle had died in the wilderness, as the Lord had vowed would happen because of their refusal to invade the first time he brought them to the land. Verse 20, that area was once considered the land of the Rephaites. Now we know from the reference earlier up in verse 10 that the Rephaites were giants. It says the land of the Rephaites who had lived there, though the Ammonites call them Zamzamites. So the Ammonites, which those descendants of Lot that were there, that they've already conquered, they referred the Rephaites to the Zamzamites. So there's another descriptive word for these giants. They were also as strong and numerous and tall as the Anakites. But notice the Anakites keep like their separate little category. You got the Rephaites, which is a general term for all of these giants, and then it seems like the Anakites keep getting separated as a separate people from these Ammonites, or what the Ammonites called the Zamzamites. And in chapter 3, Moses gives us more detail about this king Og, this giant who was the king of Bashan. In verse 11, he says he was the last survivor of the giant Rephaites. He was the last survivor of that clan or whatever. And his bed was made of iron, was more than 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. So it was like a California king. It's even bigger than that because it was 13 feet long. That's a huge bed. It can still be seen in the Ammonite city of Rabbah. So when Moses wrote this book, he was saying that his bed was actually still there in the city of Rabbah. It was actually there. You could go look at it during this time. In Deuteronomy 3, verse 13, we get a little bit more detail about what his kingdom was. It says, then I gave the rest of Gilead and all of Bashan, Og's former kingdom, to the half-tribe of Manasseh. So the half-tribe of Manasseh is getting Og's land, where this giant king named Og lived. This entire Argob region of Bashan used to be known as the land of the Rephaites. So this was the land of the Rephaites, where the half-tribe of Manasseh that's on the east side of the Jordan River, that's where they're going to live. This used to be where the Rephaites stayed. So Moses doesn't want a repeat of history. The first time that they left Egypt and they were brought to the land, it was in a different location. By the time that they were brought to the promised land, the scouts went in and came back and roused up the people, and they chose not to invade. They basically had like a coup against Moses and Aaron. So Moses doesn't want a repeat of that. So there in chapter 3, verse 21, he says, "At that time I gave Joshua," which is the guy that's taken Moses' place, he gave him this charge. "You have seen for yourself everything the Lord your God has done to these two kings. He will do the same to all the kingdoms on the west side of the Jordan. Do not be afraid of the nations there, for the Lord your God will fight for you." And you'll see when we get to the book of Joshua, the Lord actually does do a lot of the fighting, the majority of the fighting. We're going to see in a minute how prophets are introduced and what the role of prophets are. But before we get there, it's important to stop and look at Deuteronomy 3, verse 12. We'll start at 11. It says, "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountains," talking about Sinai, "while flames from the mountain shot into the sky, and the mountain was shrouded in black clouds and deep darkness. And the Lord spoke to you from the heart of the fire." He's talking about those people that came out of Egypt who witnessed this at Sinai 39 years or 40 years or so earlier. "You heard the sound of his words, but didn't see his form. There was only a voice. He proclaimed his covenant, the 10 Commandments, which he commanded you to keep, at which he wrote on 2 stone tablets. It was at that time that the Lord commanded me to teach you his decrees and regulations so you would obey them in the land you're about to enter and occupy." Then he warns them against idolatry, because what happened right after that? What happened right after that, he brought down the first set of tablets, right? And they had made themselves a golden idol. So he says in verse 19, chapter 4, after he talks about not making themselves an idol, he says, "And when you look up into the sky and see the sun, moon, and stars, all the forces of heaven, don't be seduced into worshiping them. The Lord your God gave them to all the peoples of the earth. Remember that the Lord rescued you from the iron smelting furnace of Egypt in order to make you his very own people and his special possession, which is what you are today." Verse 25, he says, "In the future, when you have children and grandchildren and have lived in the land a long time," talking about the land of Canaan, when they've taken the promised land, they've lived there for a long time, "do not corrupt yourselves by making idols of any kind. This is evil in the sight of the Lord your God and will arouse his anger." Verse 26, "Then I call on heaven and earth as witness against you. If you break my covenant, you will quickly disappear from the land you are crossing the Jordan to occupy. You will live there only a short time. Then you will be utterly destroyed, for the Lord will scatter you among the nations where only a few of you will survive. There, in a foreign land, you will worship idols made from wood and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. But from there you will search again for the Lord your God. And if you search for him with all your heart and soul, you will find him. In the distant future, when you are suffering all these things, you will finally return to the Lord your God and listen to what he tells you. For the Lord your God is merciful God. He will not abandon you or destroy you or forget the solemn covenant he made with your ancestors." God doesn't say he's not going to hold them accountable for his actions. What he says is that he will not forget his covenant that he made with their ancestors, and that he will honor his word. Just because they're being punished for something that they do that it goes against these commandments doesn't mean he's going to break his original covenant that he made with Abraham. In Deuteronomy 6, Moses gives us what Jesus will later call the greatest commandment. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 4, he says, "Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. You must commit yourselves wholeheartedly to these commands that I am giving you today. Repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you're at home and when you're on the road, when you're going to bed and when you're getting up. Tie them to your hands and wear them on your foreheads as reminders. Write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. The Lord your God will soon bring you into the land he swore to give you when he made a vow to your ancestor, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is a land with large prosperous cities that you did not build. The houses will be richly stocked with the goods you did not produce. You will draw water from cisterns you did not dig. And you will eat from vineyards and olive trees you did not plant. When you have eaten your fill in this land, be careful not to forget the Lord who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt." You know where Christianity really flourishes in places where people are oppressed. In the years after the apostles, the Christian people were oppressed by the Roman authorities. They were stuck on poles, covered with tar, lit on fire. They were sent into the Roman Colosseum to fight wild beasts. They were crucified. They were tortured in various ways. And underneath that kind of affliction, Christianity flourished. And we see today in America where we sit back and we're comfortable. We have heated and air-conditioned houses, and we have the ability to go and purchase whatever our heart desires for the most part. If not, there's programs that the government will help you get the things that you need. So America, in a lot of countries in the world actually that was formerly known as Christian nations, now because of the comfortable state they live in, aren't exactly what we would call reflecting Christian values anymore. And this is what Moses is warning about here. He says that when you are in the land and you're comfortable, right, when you've eaten your fill in this land, verse 12, be careful not to forget the Lord who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. You must fear the Lord your God and serve him. When you take an oath, you must use only his name. So he's saying, don't get so comfortable that you forget God, because when you do that, and we see that all around us, when someone doesn't depend on the Lord for their food every day, and they don't depend on the Lord for protection every day, and they start to think that they're the ones providing all that. They start to think that they're the ones that's providing the food. They're the ones that's providing protection for their house. They start to think that they're autonomous, that they're self-sufficient. And they forget that they've only been given that status because God has allowed them to be there. And that's a great point that Moses is telling them in this moment. And that's a great point for us all to remember every day. Verse 14, he says, you must not worship any of the gods of your neighboring nations, for the Lord your God who lives among you is a jealous God. His anger will flare up against you, and he will wipe you from the face of the earth. You must not test the Lord your God as you did when you complained at Massah. You must diligently obey the commands of the Lord your God and all the laws and decrees he has given you. Do what is right and good in the Lord's sight, so all will go well with you. Then you will enter and occupy the good land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors. You will drive out all the enemies living in the land, just as the Lord said you would. In the future, your children will ask you, what is the meaning of these laws, decrees, and regulations that the Lord our God has commanded us to obey? Then you must tell them, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with his strong hand. The Lord did miraculous signs and wonders before our eyes, dealing terrifying blows against Egypt and Pharaoh and all his people. He brought us out of Egypt so he could give us this land he had sworn to give our ancestors. And the Lord our God commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear him so he can continue to bless us and preserve our lives. And he has done this to this day. For he will be counted as righteous when we obey all the commands the Lord God has given us. So he's saying, don't forget where you came from, don't forget how you got here, and don't forget who sustains you in that land when you start to get comfortable. Deuteronomy 7, this is important also because we're going to run into these problems caused by these commands. And Moses is warning them before they even enter the land. He says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you're about to enter and occupy, he will clear away many nations ahead of you. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. These 7 nations are greater and more numerous than you. When the Lord your God hands these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaties with them. Make no treaties with them. And show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and your sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from me to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. This is what you must do. You must break down their pagan altars and shatter their sacred pillars. Cut down Asherah poles. Remember these words, Asherah poles, and burn their idols. For you are a holy people who belong to the Lord your God. Of all the people on earth, the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own special treasure. The Lord did not set his heart on you and choose you because you were more numerous than the other nations, although they have an army of 600,000 soldiers. For you were the smallest of all nations. Remember, they went into Egypt, they were only 70 people. Rather, it was simply that the Lord loves you, and he was keeping the oath he had sworn to your ancestors. This is why the Lord rescued you with such a strong hand from your slavery and from the oppressive hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Understand, therefore, that the Lord your God is indeed God. He is the faithful God who keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations. Lord keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations. So those that think that God changed his mind about honoring the Abrahamic covenant and preserving Israel, yeah, y'all are wrong. It's wrong. It says right here in black and white. Sorry. He is the faithful God who keeps his covenant for 1,000 generations and lavishes his unfailing love on those who love him and obey his commands. But he does not hesitate to punish and destroy those who reject him. Therefore, you must obey all these commands, decrees, and regulations I am giving you today. So again, he reiterates, God is going to honor the covenant, but he will punish those who are disobedient. Deuteronomy 7 verse 21. Do not be afraid of those nations that you're going to go to in the land of Canaan, that you're going to encounter. For the Lord your God is among you, and he is a great and awesome God. The Lord your God will drive those nations out ahead of you little by little. You will not clear them away all at once. Otherwise, the wild animals would multiply too quickly for you. But the Lord your God will hand them over to you. He will throw them into complete confusion until they are destroyed. And we see this happen. He will put their kings in your power, and you will erase their names from the face of the earth. No one will be able to stand against you, and you will destroy them all. So you remember how we talked about last week how God has been molding them and shaping them and sharpening them for the tasks that they're about to do. And then Moses tells them that verbatim in chapter 8, verse 2. This is what he says. Remember how the Lord your God led you through the wilderness for these 40 years, humbling you and testing you to prove your character and to find out whether or not you would obey his commands. Yes, he humbled you by letting you go hungry and then feeding you with manna, a food previously unknown to you and your ancestors. He did it to teach you that people do not live by bread alone. Rather, we live by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. These words are actually quoted by Jesus when he's tempted in the wilderness during those 40 days of temptation. For all these 40 years, your clothes didn't wear out and your feet didn't blister or swell. Think about it. Just as a parent disciplines a child, the Lord your God disciplines you for your own good. Christian people, you will go through hard times. This idea that once you become a Christian, everything is going to be hunky-dory is false. It's false. These people right here have been groomed and shaped to be the exact people that they are right now. And he's telling them, I have put you through this hardship to build you into the people that you are. And if they weren't the people that they are, they wouldn't be able to accomplish the tasks that they're about to go do. In the same way, God shapes us and molds us through hardships and through all those things in life. So, and the things that make us uncomfortable in life, to build us into the people that we are, so that we can accomplish whatever task it is that He has for us. And the thing is they are told what their task is, and a lot of us go through life not knowing what our task is, whatever our God-given purpose is, or what our task is. And we do that, we understand that just by seeking His will and walking with Him every day. You get up in the morning and you pray in the morning, Lord, help me to walk with you today. Help me to accomplish your purpose today. Help me to live for you today, not for myself today. Help me to get me out of the way and help me to serve you wisely and properly today. And That's all God's showing us in the big picture. He's showing us in the big picture that it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about Him. In Deuteronomy 9, Moses says, "Listen, O Israel, today you're about to cross the Jordan River to take over the land belonging to the nations much greater and more powerful than you. They live in cities with walls that reach to the sky. These people are strong, tall, descendants of the famous Anakite giants. You've heard the saying, who can stand up to the Anakites?" Evidently this was a saying during their time. "But recognize today that the Lord your God is the one who will cross over ahead of you like a devouring fire to destroy them. He will subdue them so that you will quickly conquer them and drive them out, just as the Lord has promised. After the Lord your God has done this for you, don't say in your hearts, 'The Lord has given us this land because we are such good people.' No, it is because of the wickedness of the other nations that it is pushing them out of your way." So it's not because how good they are, it's about how bad they are. He's punishing them. "It is not because you are so good or have such integrity that you are about to occupy their land. The Lord your God will drive these nations out ahead of you only because of their wickedness, and to fulfill the oath He swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You must recognize that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land because you are good, for you are not. You are a stubborn people." And that's been demonstrated all through since they left Egypt. That's been demonstrated how stubborn they are. They're constantly rebelling against Moses. They're constantly, complaining about not having water, not having food, not having this, not having that. And all God was trying to get them to do was trust Him. Trust Him that they need to depend on Him and not on their own resourcefulness, not on their own understanding. Deuteronomy 10, he tells us there in verse 5 that He placed the tablets in the ark, and at this time when they're about to cross the Jordan River, those tablets are still in the ark. Deuteronomy 10 verse 12, he says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you?" What does God require of you? He requires only that you fear the Lord your God and live in a way that pleases Him, and love Him and serve Him with all your heart and soul. That's what God requires. That's still what God requires of us today. And everybody gets wrapped around this word fear. He's not talking about fear like fright, like horror movie, be in terror of. He's talking about respect. Have a respectful reverence for. We used to have a saying when I was a kid that your parents or some event put the fear of God in you. And what that usually meant was that you now respect that situation, that tool, or that person. You respect them enough to be more reverent and careful about your interaction with that person, place, or thing. That's all God's trying to get across to him here. He's not talking about fear, be anxiously afraid. That's not what he's saying. Deuteronomy 11 verse 10, he says, "For the land you're about to enter and take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you came, where you planted your seed and made irrigation ditches with your foot as in a vegetable garden." Now remember, the Nile, the banks of the Nile where they farmed, it flooded every year. So the river would flood, and then when the flood subsided, the river narrowed and went back into its banks, they would farm that area. And it was this whole system, this whole ecosystem, this whole codependent thing, this relationship that the Egyptians had with the Nile. In verse 11 he says, "Rather the land you will soon take over is a land of hills and valleys with plenty of rain, a land that the Lord your God cares for. He watches over it through each season of the year." So he's just saying that the way you farm there is not going to be the same way you farm here. But God has got it. God is going to take care of it. God sends rain. It's a very fertile place. Deuteronomy 12, start there in verse 2. He says, "When you drive out the nations that live there, you must destroy all the places where they worship their gods, high on the mountains, up on the hills, and under every green tree." You'll see how they go back to this later on. Verse 3, "Break down their altars and smash their sacred pillars, burn their Asherah poles, and cut down their carved idols. Completely erase the names of their gods." The kings will actually allow these Asherah poles to be built and erected in their future. Verse 4, Do not worship the Lord your God in the way these pagan peoples worship their gods. Rather, you must seek the Lord your God at the place of worship He Himself will choose from among all the tribes, the place where His name will be honored. So God says, you're not going to be able to worship the same way as you're worshiping now. God will choose a designated place, and there you will set up the tabernacle, and there you will have to come from your land, wherever your tribal land is. You have to come from there to that place that He chooses and make your sacrifices there, rather than it just be within the camp. So they got it easy right now. In verse 8, he goes on, he says, your pattern of worship will change. Today all of you are doing as you please, because you have not yet arrived at the place of rest, the land your Lord your God is giving you as your special possession. So he's saying, like, right now we're all in the camp together, and you all can just come whenever you want and make your sacrifice. But when you're all split up and you're spread all over the land of Canaan, and you're in your tribal area, you will have to come to wherever the tabernacle is, and you will have to come. Then you just can't come every day or every other day like you're doing now. You're going to have to make a trip out of it. Verse 11, he says, you must bring everything I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your sacred offerings, your offerings to fulfill a vow, to the designated place of worship, the place the Lord your God chooses for His name to be honored. So the Lord will tell them where that place is going to be within one of those tribal regions. In chapter 15, Moses gives us more detail about the 7th year, the Sabbath year. He says you have to release debts and then release servants from their debt on that 7th year. So we knew that was already going to happen in the year of Jubilee. Earlier we read, but now we also see on the Sabbath year they're going to do that also. If they're an indentured servant and they're going to be in servitude to another person because of their debt that they have, they're going to be released from that debt on the 7th year. Chapter 16, he says, appoint judges and officials for yourselves from each of your tribes in all the towns the Lord your God is giving you. They must judge the people fairly. You must never twist justice or show partiality. Never accept a bribe, judge, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and corrupt the decisions of the godly. So these bribes will corrupt you, judge. Let true justice prevail, so you may live and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You must never set up a wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to the Lord your God, and never set up sacred pillars for worship, for the Lord your God hates them. These are all those things that they're doing there in the land they're about to take over, and these are things that they will permit, the kings will permit later on, unfortunately. Verse 6, he says, never put a person to death on the testimony of only one witness. There must always be 2 or 3 witnesses. The witnesses, now the people that claim to have witnessed this, must throw the first stone. And later, Jesus will actually tell the people that are accusing a woman of adultery, like, those of you that don't have any guilt, you throw the first stone. And what he's actually doing, he's quoting this piece of scripture right here. He says the witnesses must throw the first stone, because if there's not 2 or 3 witnesses, you can't execute that person. He's using this specific set of instructions right there to show how off kilter they are. There's not even witnesses to this, and if there are a witness, there's not 2 or 3, and then those witnesses also have to cast the first stone, and that's exactly what Jesus points out to them, and then they all drop their stones and walk away. Now this is important, because we're going to see this come to fruition fairly quickly. We're going to go through the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, and then when we get to Samuel, you're going to start seeing this passage right here really come to fruition. Moses says, he says, well, you're about to enter the land your Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. That actually happens. If this happens, he says, if this happens, be sure to select as king the man your Lord God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up a large stable of horses, Solomon, for himself, or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. for the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. Solomon, the king must not take many wives for himself. Solomon, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. When he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. Now you'll see when we start seeing how the kings are ruling, you can see none of them actually are doing this. Because if they were doing this, if they were writing their own copy of the law down in presence of Levitical priests, if they were doing that and they were handwriting this, they would have those commandments in their head, and there's several things and several mistakes that they make that they wouldn't have made, such as when David tries to bring the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem the first time. It doesn't do it in accordance with the law, and people die because of it, and then it's delayed again before they can actually bring it. He goes back and he reviews the law, and then he understands, okay, yeah, we were doing it wrong. Then he goes back and they do it properly, and then they can bring the Ark of the Covenant into the city. This regular reading will prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he is above his fellow citizens. It will also prevent him from turning away from these commands in the smallest way. It will ensure that he and his descendants will reign for many generations in Israel. Then we're given instructions for how to deal with the prophet and the function of the prophet. There in chapter 18, verses 15 through 22. He says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. Like me, Moses, from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him, for this is what you yourselves requested the Lord your God when you were assembled at Mount Sinai. Remember, they said that they couldn't stand the sound of his voice because it was too powerful. They couldn't be in his presence. So that's what he's reminding them of. He says he's going to send you prophets instead because you said you couldn't take it. You said, don't let us hear the voice of the Lord your God anymore or see this blazing fire, for we will die. And that's what he's doing. He's quoting what they said at Sinai. Verse 18, he says, I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the message that the prophet proclaims on my behalf. But any prophet who falsely claims to speak in my name or who speaks in the name of another god must die. So prophets are going to serve as the function of getting the word from God and then giving it to the people. The people then are going to use the Levitical priests to the function of Levitical priests for them to give back to God. So it's going to work like a cycle. The prophets are going to receive the word. The prophet's going to tell the people are going to take their action, they'll repent or whatever, make sacrifice with the priest. The priest then makes that communication back to God that way. He says, verse 21, but you may wonder, how will we know whether or not a prophecy is from the Lord? Because you could have false prophets. Verse 22, if the prophet speaks in the Lord's name, but his prediction does not happen or come true, you will know that the Lord did not give that message. That prophet has spoken without my authority and need not be feared. So that prophet whose things that he says does not come true is a false prophet. And that's how you tell the difference between true prophets and false prophets. If what they prophesied comes true, then they're a true prophet. If what they prophesied doesn't come true, then they're a false prophet. Later on, you'll see how the prophets, they will give a short prophecy, and that'll be fulfilled in the ears of and in the sight of the people that are around him. And that short prophecy being fulfilled will prove that whatever he says is the long-term prophecy is true. So he's going to fulfill a short-term prophecy to prove that his long-term prophecy is true. Verse 19, verse 15, he goes again. He says, you must not convict anyone of a crime on the testimony of only one witness. The facts of the case must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy 20, verse 2, when you prepare for battle, the priest must come forward to speak to the troops. You'll see how King Saul doesn't wait on Samuel to get there later on, and he just goes ahead and he doesn't wait on the priest. He makes a sacrifice himself because he's getting rushed by the people, and because the forces looks like they're going to invade. He's in a rush, and he doesn't heed this command, and he has big problems because of that. So that wraps up this week's snapshot of some things maybe that are given a little bit more detail in Deuteronomy that we maybe didn't focus on in the previous 3 books, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. We'll probably finish up Deuteronomy this week before we head into Joshua. Joshua is going to take these books, and then he, as the leader, the kind of the replacement for Moses, then is going to lead this army of 600,000 across the River Jordan, and they're going to attack Jericho. So very interesting stuff coming up, exciting stuff coming up. Just hang with us, and we'll see you next week.